Most gardeners think a productive garden has to start over every spring. New seeds, new seedlings, new soil, and the same cycle all over again. But beneath the surface, some plants are playing a completely different game. Their roots and rhizomes store energy, survive from one season to the next, and can produce a new harvest without you having to start from zero. And when you grow these plants in containers, something even more interesting happens. A container isn't simply a smaller garden bed. For certain perennial root crops, it can become a controlled underground food system. Today, we're looking at 10 perennial root crops you can plant once and potentially harvest from for years. Some are familiar, others are almost forgotten. Some spread so aggressively that a container actually becomes an advantage. And the most fascinating part is that the real harvest isn't always what you see above the soil. While the leaves and stems grow in the sunlight, an entirely different food-producing system is developing underneath. So if you're tired of replanting your vegetable garden every year, these are 10 underground crops worth knowing. At number 10, Chinese artichoke, also known as Crosne. This is one of those vegetables that looks almost too unusual to belong in an ordinary garden. The edible tubers are small, white, and strangely segmented, almost like tiny pieces of coral. But beneath that unusual appearance is a plant with one very useful characteristic for long-term gardeners. It can return from underground structures and continue producing new tubers. Crosne isn't the kind of crop you grow for one enormous harvest. Its appeal is completely different. Once established, it can form a network of underground growth that continues its cycle season after season. Instead of treating the plant as something that has to be completely removed after harvest, you can think of it as a living underground system that renews itself. And that's exactly why it becomes interesting in a container. In a traditional garden bed, perennial root crops can sometimes become difficult to monitor. Small tubers can remain hidden underground, and the plant can gradually expand beyond the area where you originally wanted it. In a container, that underground growth is naturally contained. The same characteristic that makes perennial root crops valuable also becomes easier to manage. Crosne also offers something that many perennial vegetables don't: curiosity. It's an unusual crop that can make a container garden feel less predictable. You aren't simply growing another carrot or potato. You're growing something that produces its food underground while maintaining a cycle of regrowth from one season to the next. The real lesson here is that perennial gardening isn't necessarily about finding the biggest crop. Sometimes the value is in finding a plant that can maintain itself with relatively little intervention after it becomes established. You harvest the small tubers, leave enough of the underground system to continue the cycle, and the garden doesn't have to return to zero. That's what makes Crosne a fascinating introduction to this list. It may produce small roots, but it represents a very big idea. The best perennial crops don't make you start over every year. They leave something behind that can become tomorrow's harvest. At number 9, Arrowroot. Most gardeners think of root crops as plants you grow for one harvest, dig up, eat, and then replace. Arrowroot offers a completely different possibility. This tropical perennial develops underground rhizomes that store energy for the plant, allowing it to continue its growth cycle in return when conditions are favorable. Above the soil, it produces lush green foliage, but the real story is happening underneath. While the leaves capture sunlight, the rhizomes quietly store energy and prepare the plant for another season. That's what makes arrowroot so interesting for a long-term food garden. You're not simply growing a crop for this year, you're establishing an underground system that can potentially keep producing in future seasons. Instead of starting from zero with seeds or young plants every spring, an established arrowroot can begin its next cycle with an underground foundation already in place. The first season builds the system. Future seasons can build on it. For container gardeners, this underground growth pattern has another advantage. Some perennial root crops can spread aggressively when planted directly in the ground. A container gives you much more control over where the rhizomes develop. Instead of allowing the plant to slowly occupy an entire garden bed, you can keep its underground system contained and easier to manage. In this case, the container isn't simply a smaller garden. It becomes a way to control a perennial crop. Arrowroot also teaches an important lesson about perennial gardening. The most valuable part of the plant may be the part you never see. The foliage above ground is essentially collecting solar energy, while the rhizomes below ground are storing that energy for the future. What looks like an ordinary tropical plant can actually be building a renewable food source underneath the surface. Because arrowroot is tropical, it naturally performs best in warm climates. Cold conditions can interrupt its growth cycle, so it isn't a universal choice for every gardener. But where the climate suits it, arrowroot can become a fascinating long-term addition to a container food garden. And that's why it earns the number 9 spot. You're not just planting a vegetable. You're establishing something that can remain alive beneath the soil and potentially return season after season. Plant once, build underground, harvest for years. At number 8, oca, also known as New Zealand yam. This is one of those root crops that looks almost ordinary above the soil, but underneath it is building an entirely different kind of food system. Oca is a perennial tuber-forming plant that produces small, colorful underground tubers, and once established, those tubers can become the starting point for the next growing cycle. Instead of thinking about oca as a crop you plant once and completely remove, think of it as a plant that can leave part of itself behind to keep the system going. That is what makes oca so interesting for gardeners who want to move away from the annual vegetable cycle. Most vegetables ask you to repeat the same process every year. Buy seeds, start plants, grow them, harvest them, clear the container, and begin again. Oca offers a different possibility. The underground tubers are not only the harvest, they are also part of the plant's survival strategy. With the right conditions, some of that underground system can remain available to begin another season. And this is where containers become particularly valuable. Oca develops its edible crop underground, so a dedicated container gives you a defined space where that underground production can be managed. You don't have to disturb an entire garden bed just to find the harvest, and you can keep a perennial tuber crop separated from plants that need to be replanted every year. For small space gardeners, that's a powerful idea. One container can become a long-term food-producing asset instead of another temporary vegetable pot. Oca also has an interesting relationship with the seasons. Unlike many warm-season crops that slow down as the growing season changes, oca's tuber development is closely connected to shortening days and cooler conditions. The plant can spend much of its growing period building foliage and energy above ground before putting more attention into the underground tubers later in the season. That means patience becomes part of the strategy. That's why oca earns the number 8 spot. It combines an unusual edible harvest, underground storage, and the potential for a repeating cycle, all inside a plant that can become a fascinating long-term addition to a container food garden. You're not simply growing another root crop. You're building a food system that can remember where it started. At number 7, taro. Taro is another perennial crop where the most valuable part of the plant develops below the surface. Above ground, its large leaves create a lush, tropical appearance, but underneath, the plant develops corms and underground structures that can help generate the next generation of plants. That ability to regenerate is what makes taro so interesting for a long-term food garden. Instead of thinking of it as a single harvest, think of it as a plant with a built-in renewal system. The underground corm can become part of the next cycle, meaning the garden doesn't necessarily have to return to zero after harvesting. And containers can make this system easier to manage. Taro appreciates consistent moisture and warm conditions, so a dedicated container gives you much more control over its growing environment than simply placing it somewhere in a mixed garden bed. More importantly, you can keep its underground growth contained and maintain it as a permanent part of your food garden. Taro also demonstrates another principle of perennial gardening. The plant itself can become your source of future planting material. Instead of constantly buying new seeds or plants, established underground structures can help maintain the cycle. Of course, taro isn't a plant for every climate. It prefers warmth and moisture, so gardeners in colder regions need to think about seasonal protection. But where conditions are suitable, it can become a remarkably productive long-term crop. That's why taro earns number 7. You're not simply growing a plant that produces food. You're building a renewable underground system where today's growth can help create tomorrow's harvest. At number 6, ginger. Most gardeners think of ginger as something you buy at the grocery store, not something that can become part of a long-term home food system. But ginger is actually a rhizome, and that changes everything. The part we eat is growing underground, where the plant stores energy and continues developing new growth. What makes ginger especially interesting is that you don't always have to think of the entire plant as a one-time harvest. An established rhizome can contain multiple growing points, allowing the plant to continue its cycle when conditions are favorable. Instead of treating every harvest as the end of the plant, you can think of the rhizome as both food and future planting material. That makes ginger a natural fit for the perennial mindset. Harvest from the system without destroying the entire system. Containers also give ginger an advantage, because the underground rhizomes remain contained and easy to manage. For gardeners with limited space, that's important. You can dedicate one container to a crop that produces its food underground without needing a large garden bed. Ginger does prefer warm conditions, so climate plays a major role in whether it can remain outdoors year-round. In colder regions, the goal is not to force it through unsuitable weather, but to protect the container or treat it as a seasonal crop with the potential to continue from healthy rhizomes. The real lesson from ginger is simple. A perennial food garden doesn't always have to be about harvesting the entire plant. Sometimes the smartest strategy is to take what you need while preserving the underground system that can produce again. That's why ginger earns the number 6 spot. One rhizome can represent both today's harvest and tomorrow's garden. At number 5, turmeric. Most people know turmeric as the golden yellow spice found in kitchens around the world. But beneath its green foliage is something much more interesting for a long-term gardener. An underground network of rhizomes that stores energy and can continue the plant's life cycle. Turmeric is a warm climate perennial, which means that under suitable conditions it doesn't have to disappear completely after one harvest. The rhizomes can remain underground and produce new growth when the next favorable season arrives. That makes it less like a traditional annual vegetable and more like a living underground food reserve. And this is where containers become useful. A dedicated container keeps the rhizomes contained and makes the plant easier to manage as a long-term crop. Instead of disturbing the entire garden every year, you can maintain one established turmeric system and harvest from it when the rhizomes are mature. There's also an important lesson in what you don't see. For months, the most obvious part of the plant is the foliage above ground, but beneath that foliage, the rhizomes are quietly storing energy. The plant may look relatively ordinary from the surface while building the part you'll eventually value most. That's why turmeric rewards patience. The goal isn't always immediate harvest. Sometimes the better strategy is allowing the plant to spend an entire growing season building an underground reserve that can support future growth. Of course, turmeric is best suited to warm climates, while colder gardeners may need to protect the rhizomes from freezing conditions. But where the climate works, turmeric can become more than a spice crop. It can become a long-term container food system, and that's why turmeric takes the number 5 position. The harvest may disappear from your kitchen, but the plant doesn't necessarily have to disappear from your garden. At number 4, Yacon. This is one of those perennial crops that completely changes the way you think about what's happening beneath a container. Above ground, Yacon grows into a large, lush plant with broad leaves. But underground, it develops large, edible storage roots that can become the real reward of the entire growing season. What makes Yacon particularly interesting is its perennial growth habit. The plant doesn't simply exist for one harvest and disappear forever. Its underground crown and buds can help produce new growth in the following season, allowing the same established system to continue rather than forcing you to begin again from a seed every year. And this is where containers become surprisingly useful. Yacon can become a substantial plant, so the container isn't necessarily about making the crop tiny. It's about creating a controlled environment for a perennial root system. You know exactly where the underground growth is, and you can dedicate that space to a crop designed to return year after year. Yacon also represents an important principle of perennial gardening. The visible plant is often just the engine powering the hidden harvest. Those large leaves capture sunlight throughout the growing season, while the underground system converts that energy into storage roots. The bigger and healthier the plant becomes above ground, the more interesting the potential harvest below. The reward comes from patience. Yacon isn't about grabbing a quick vegetable a few weeks after planting. It's about allowing the plant to build its underground reserves over a much longer growing cycle. That's precisely what makes perennial crops different from ordinary container vegetables. Climate matters too. Yacon prefers a long, warm, growing season and doesn't tolerate severe freezing conditions well. But where the climate is suitable, it can become a fascinating long-term addition to a food garden. That's why Yacon earns the number 4 position. It gives you a large underground harvest while maintaining the possibility of another generation from the same established plant. One plant above the soil, a food reserve below it, and potentially another harvest waiting in the seasons ahead. At number 3, American Groundnut. If you've never heard of this plant, you're not alone. American Groundnut is a native North American perennial vine that produces edible underground tubers, making it one of the most interesting forgotten food crops on this list. Above ground, it behaves like a climbing vine, which immediately gives it an advantage for container gardeners. Instead of demanding a huge horizontal footprint, the plant can use vertical space while developing its edible tubers underground. That creates a fascinating two-level food system. The vines grow toward the sky while the harvest develops beneath your feet. But the real reason American Groundnut makes this list is its perennial nature. The plant can survive through underground structures and return in future seasons. Some of those tubers can be harvested for food, while remaining underground material can help maintain the colony. That means you're not necessarily destroying the entire system every time you harvest. This is the kind of crop that perfectly represents the perennial mindset. You're not simply planting food, you're establishing a living system that can reproduce and expand underground while producing something edible at the same time. And containers can make that behavior much easier to manage. In open ground, a vigorous perennial vine and its underground tubers can eventually spread beyond the area you originally intended. A container creates boundaries. It turns a potentially sprawling underground system into something you can observe and control. American Groundnut is also valuable because it reminds us that perennial food crops don't have to be exotic imports. Sometimes the most interesting options are plants that have been growing naturally in a region for generations, but simply disappeared from modern gardens. That's why it earns the number 3 spot. It combines vertical growth, edible underground tubers, perennial regeneration, and container-friendly control in one remarkable plant. And once you discover crops like this, the question changes from what should I plant next spring to something much more interesting. What food system can I establish now that will still be here next year? At number 2, horseradish. Most gardeners have the opposite problem with this plant. Instead of worrying about whether it will survive, they sometimes wonder how to stop it from coming back. Horseradish is an extremely vigorous perennial, and its underground roots can survive and produce new growth season after season. And that trait, which can be frustrating in a traditional garden bed, becomes a major advantage when you put the plant inside a container. This is one of the best examples of why containers aren't always about growing smaller. Sometimes they're about controlling powerful plants. In the ground, even small pieces of horseradish root can potentially produce new growth. Over time, the plant can spread beyond the area where you originally wanted it. A dedicated container creates a boundary around that underground system, allowing you to turn its aggressive nature into a reliable, long-term food supply. And there's another reason horseradish fits this list so well. The real harvest is underground. Above ground, the plant produces large green leaves, but below the surface it is building the thick roots that gardeners actually want. Once established, that underground system can remain productive instead of requiring you to restart the crop every year. This creates a completely different relationship with the garden. You're no longer treating the plant as a temporary guest. You're giving it a permanent place in your food system. The container becomes its home, the roots become its storage system, and each season adds another chapter to the same plant's life. Of course, that doesn't mean you should completely ignore it. A vigorous perennial still needs to be managed, especially if you want to maintain a healthy and productive root system. But compared with delicate annual crops that need to be replanted every year, Horseradish has one huge advantage: it's extremely difficult to kill. And that's exactly why it earns the number 2 position. The characteristic that makes horseradish troublesome in an open garden can make it incredibly valuable in a controlled container. You don't have to fight its persistence. You simply give that persistence a boundary. And at number 1, Jerusalem Artichoke. If this entire list is about finding plants that can turn one planting into years of potential harvests, Jerusalem Artichoke may be the perfect example. Also known as sunchoke, this perennial produces edible underground tubers while sending tall stems and foliage high above the soil. The plant grows, stores energy underground, and leaves behind tubers capable of producing another generation. That's what makes it so powerful. You aren't dealing with a crop that has to be completely rebuilt every spring. The underground system can survive, multiply, and return. In fact, the same characteristic that makes Jerusalem Artichoke incredibly persistent in the ground can become an advantage when you grow it in a container. The container acts like a boundary around an otherwise vigorous perennial. Instead of allowing the plant to spread through an entire garden bed, you can dedicate one large growing space to it and keep its underground production contained. It's almost like having a permanent underground pantry that comes back to life every growing season. There's also something beautifully simple about the system. The tall stems above ground capture sunlight and turn that energy into underground storage. By the end of the season, the part you care about most is hidden beneath the soil. And when the next growing season arrives, some of those underground structures can become the starting point for new growth. That is the essence of perennial gardening. The harvest doesn't have to be the end of the plant. And Jerusalem Artichoke takes that idea to an extreme. You can harvest the tubers you need while maintaining enough of the underground system to continue the cycle. Instead of constantly buying seeds, starting seedlings, and rebuilding your garden from scratch, you are maintaining an established food-producing system. That is why Jerusalem Artichoke deserves the number 1 spot. It isn't just a perennial vegetable. It's an example of what happens when a plant is allowed to build its own underground infrastructure. Most vegetable gardens operate on the same cycle. Plant in spring, harvest in summer, clear everything away, and start again next year. But perennial root crops give us another option. They allow part of the garden to remain alive beneath the soil, storing energy and preparing for another season while we simply maintain the system. The bigger lesson isn't simply to grow more vegetables, it's to grow fewer plants that keep giving back. A container doesn't have to be filled with something you harvest once and throw away. It can become a permanent part of your food garden, an underground system that continues working long after you planted it. Because the ultimate goal of perennial gardening isn't to eliminate work completely. It's to make sure that the work you do today keeps paying you back for years to come.